And I'm truly sorry to everyone I've hurt. Thank you, Your Honor.
He was the man who kept your neighborhood safe. He wore a badge. He carried a gun. He swore an oath to protect you. And then, at night, he took off the uniform, put on a mask, and became the most prolific serial predator in the history of the United States. For more than a decade, from 1973 to 1986, a man terrorized the entire state of California. He broke into homes in the middle of the night while families slept. He attacked over 50 women. He murdered 13 people, including couples who were bludgeoned to death in their own beds. He stacked dishes on the back of his male victims so that if they moved, he would hear them. Then he went into the next room. He disappeared in 1986. Completely. No trace. No leads. No name. For 44 years, detectives across 10 counties in California hunted one man they could not find, a ghost who had walked freely among his victims and had even been paid to protect them. Then a woman dying of an obsession she could not explain, a true crime writer working in her kitchen in the middle of the night, wrote a name she would never live to see arrested. And then DNA did something that 40 years of police work could not. It found him. Sitting in his own driveway. In Sacramento. In the summer of 1973, America was distracted. The Vietnam War was winding down. Watergate was consuming Washington. Nixon was on television. And in the small agricultural town of Exeter, California, population less than 8,000, a young man named James DeAngelo Jr had just been hired as a police officer. He was 27 years old. He had served in the United States Navy during Vietnam. He had a degree in criminal justice from California State University, Sacramento. By every measure that society uses to judge a man, Joseph DeAngelo was exactly the kind of person you were supposed to trust. He carried a badge. He responded to emergencies. He pulled over speeding cars. He was the man your children were taught to run to if they were in trouble. Nobody knew, not his colleagues, not his neighbors, not his girlfriend, that Joseph DeAngelo had already begun breaking into homes. That by the time he put on the Exeter Police Department uniform for the first time, something inside of him had already crossed a line that no human being is supposed to cross. In 1975, while still serving as a police officer in Exeter, DeAngelo drove 10 miles to the neighboring town of Visalia. A man named Claude Snelling was at home with his daughter. DeAngelo attempted to abduct the young woman from her own home. When Claude Snelling came to defend his daughter, DeAngelo shot him dead. Right in front of her. He then kicked the girl 3 times in the face and fled. Claude Snelling was 45 years old. He died on his own property trying to protect his child. His killer went back to work as a police officer the next morning. In 1976, DeAngelo was reassigned to the Auburn Police Department, 40 miles north of Sacramento. It was in the East Sacramento area, known as the East Bay, that the attacks began in earnest. He called himself nothing. He had no name. He was simply a figure who appeared in the dark and was gone before dawn. Investigators, desperately trying to connect dozens of reports of a masked intruder, began calling him the East Area Rapist. He had a method so precise and so chilling that detectives believed it had been specifically developed by someone with a law enforcement background. Someone who understood how investigations worked. Someone who knew what evidence to leave and what evidence to destroy. He was right. He did know. Because he was one of them. The East Area Rapist did not operate on impulse. He was a predator who planned each attack weeks, sometimes months, in advance. Neighbors would later recall seeing a bicyclist moving slowly through their streets in the days before an attack, pausing, watching, taking note of which houses had lights on at what time, which cars were parked outside, which families had dogs, which couples left the windows unlocked on warm nights. That bicyclist was DeAngelo. Scouting. Learning. Memorizing. He struck almost exclusively at night, between midnight and 3 a.m. He carried pre-cut shoelaces, hundreds of them, because rope leaves fibers that can be traced. He brought his own tools. He wore a mask. He disabled porch lights before he ever touched a door. He had studied crime scenes. He knew what investigators looked for. He made sure not to give it to them. His pattern with couples was particularly sadistic, and documented in detail by investigators across multiple counties. He would enter a home, bind the male victim face down on the floor, stack plates or cups on the man's back, telling him that if he heard them fall, he would kill everyone in the house. He would then take the woman into another room. The plates were not an act of improvisation. They were a calculated psychological instrument. The sound of crockery meant survival. Silence meant he was still in control. He also called his victims. Before attacks, and sometimes in the weeks following, he would telephone the homes he had targeted. Survivors described hearing nothing but breathing on the line, and then, occasionally, a low voice. One survivor, decades later, recalled a single phrase spoken to her over the phone after he had already been inside her home. She did not repeat it in court. She said only that she had never forgotten the sound of his voice. That she never would. Between 1976 and 1979, more than 50 women in the East Bay area of Sacramento were attacked. Investigators knew they were looking for the same man. But the East area rapist left almost nothing behind. A partial boot print. An occasional smudge. Shoelaces, hundreds of identical shoelaces that could not be traced to any specific store. In 1979, Joseph DeAngelo was fired from the Auburn Police Department, not for anything related to the rapes. He had been caught shoplifting a hammer and a can of dog repellent from a Pay 'n Save store. His police career was over. The attacks were not. In late 1979, something changed. The East area rapist, who had until then left survivors, began leaving none. On the night of December 30, 1979, in the coastal town of Goleta near Santa Barbara, Dr. Robert Offerman and his girlfriend, Deborah Manning, were found dead inside their condominium. They had been bound, and bludgeoned. The killer had left through a window. He was gone before first light. It was the first time investigators in Southern California connected the crimes to the man who had terrorized the East Bay. The East area rapist had moved south. And he had upgraded from rape to murder. Southern California investigators, who had no knowledge of the East Bay cases, gave him a new name, the original Night Stalker. They did not know they were hunting the same man. It would take over 20 years, and the development of DNA technology, to confirm that the East area rapist and the original Night Stalker were one and the same person. On March 13, 1980, in Ventura County, a successful attorney named Lyman Smith and his wife Charlene were murdered in their home. Lyman Smith, 43, had been on the short list for an appointment to the Superior Court bench. Charlene, 33, was an interior decorator. They were found bound with a drapery cord tied in an unusual knot, later identified as a diamond knot. The same knot that had appeared at East area rapist scenes 400 miles north. It was Lyman Smith's 12-year-old son who found them. That detail was not reported in 1980. It was only revealed when the case was finally closed, decades later. On August 19, 1980, Keith Harrington, a 24-year-old fourth-year medical student at UC Irvine, and his wife Patrice, a registered pediatric nurse aged 27, were found bludgeoned to death in their gated Laguna Niguel home. They had been married for only a few months. Their home was in a community with a security gate. The killer had walked past it without difficulty. Keith's brother, Bruce Harrington, spent the next 2 decades of his life fighting for justice, ultimately lobbying for a change in California state law that would require convicted criminals to submit DNA samples. The law passed in 2004. It was called Proposition 69. The DNA sample that law eventually generated from one of Joseph DeAngelo's relatives would, 14 years later, point directly to him. The murders continued. In February 1981, Manuela Withun was killed in her home in Irvine. Her husband was in the hospital at the time. She was alone. In July 1981, Sherry Domingo and her friend Gregory Sanchez were murdered in Goleta. Then, silence. For 5 years, nothing. On May 4, 1986, in Irvine, just a few blocks from where Manuela Withun had been killed 5 years earlier, 18-year-old Janelle Cruz was found murdered in her home. She had been left in her own bed. Her parents were away for the weekend. She was his last known victim. After Janelle Cruz, the Golden State Killer vanished. He was 40 years old. He returned to his home in Sacramento. He got a job at a supermarket distribution company. He had a daughter. He grew old. And the families of his 13 murdered victims received nothing. If you are still here, type "still here" in the comments right now. Let us see who is truly following this story. Who is sitting with the weight of what these families have carried. Because the hardest part of this story is not what he did, it is how long he got away with it. Like this video so that more people find it. Subscribe if you haven't already. These families waited 44 years. The least we can do is make sure the world knows. In 2013, a true crime writer named Michelle McNamara became obsessed with a case that most of the public had forgotten. She was not a detective. She was not a forensic scientist. She was a writer from Illinois who had moved to Los Angeles, married the comedian Patton Oswalt, and had a daughter. She had a blog. She had a research obsession that she described as something she could not turn off, even when she tried. Michelle McNamara began filing public records requests, contacting retired investigators, cross-referencing police reports from 10 different counties in California, and building a database of cases that no single law enforcement agency had ever been able to see as a whole. She gave him his final name, the Golden State Killer. She believed, based on her research, that he was still alive. That he had a family. That he was living an ordinary life somewhere in California. That he went to the grocery store and paid his bills and attended neighborhood barbecues and nobody, not one person, knew what he had done. She was right on every count. In April 2016, Michelle McNamara died in her sleep of an accidental overdose of prescription medication. She was 46 years old. Her book, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, was unfinished. Her husband, Patton Oswalt, and her research team completed it. It was published in February 2018. She never knew she had helped catch him. She never knew that the attention her book focused on the case would push investigators to take one more step. She never knew his name. But investigators were listening. And they had something they had never had before. For decades, investigators had preserved biological evidence from the Golden State Killer's crime scenes. They had a DNA profile. A genetic fingerprint of the man who had committed 13 murders and over 50 rapes. But a DNA profile is worthless without a match, and the Golden State Killer's DNA appeared in no law enforcement database anywhere in the United States. He had never been arrested for anything serious enough to require a DNA sample. Because until 1979, he was a police officer. And after 1979, he was invisible. In 2017, Paul Holes, a forensic investigator with Contra Costa County who had spent years working the case, made contact with a genetic genealogist named Barbara Rae-Venter. She had helped identify a serial killer known as the Biting Bandit using a technique that had never been used in a criminal investigation before. Genetic genealogy. Taking an unknown DNA sample and running it not against a criminal database, but against a public one. Against the millions of ordinary Americans who had voluntarily uploaded their own genetic information to ancestry websites in search of relatives and family history. The killer had never uploaded his own DNA. But some of his distant relatives had. Third cousins. Fourth cousins. People who had no idea they were related to one of the most dangerous serial criminals in American history. People who had simply clicked a button on a genealogy website and sent in a tube of saliva to find out where their great-great-grandmother came from. Barbara Rae-Venter took those partial matches and began to build a family tree. A massive, branching, painstaking reconstruction of the killer's family, working backwards from distant relatives, eliminating branches based on age, sex, geography, and criminal history. It took months. The family tree stretched across hundreds of names. But eventually, the branches narrowed. The list of possible suspects shrank from thousands to dozens to single digits. One name stood at the end of the narrowest branch. Joseph James DeAngelo. Age 72. Living at 8334 Turning Leaf Way in Citrus Heights, a suburb of Sacramento. Retired. Quiet. Unremarkable. The same city where he had committed some of his earliest rapes 40 years before. He had never left. Investigators did not approach him. They did not knock on his door. They placed him under covert surveillance and waited. On April 18, 2018, Joseph James DeAngelo discarded a tissue in a public place. Investigators retrieved it. They extracted his DNA. They sent it to the lab. 6 days later, they had their answer. The DNA from the tissue was a complete and definitive match to the DNA recovered from the Golden State Killer's crime scenes. After 44 years, they had him. On April 24, 2018, at 8:30 in the morning, Joseph James DeAngelo walked out of his front door. The surveillance team moved in. Sacramento County Sheriff's Department officers approached him in his driveway. They placed him in handcuffs. He was 72 years old. He was wearing casual clothes. He looked like someone's grandfather. He did not resist. He said nothing. That afternoon, Sacramento County District Attorney and Marie Schubert stood in front of cameras and made the announcement that 44 years of investigators had dreamed of making. The answer has always been in Sacramento. For over 40 years, countless victims have waited for this moment. Today, we have found the Golden State Killer. Later, in an interview room, DeAngelo, not knowing he was being recorded, spoke to himself. Investigators preserved the recording. In it, he referred to an inner personality he called Jerry, a force he described as compelling him to commit the crimes. "I did all those things," he said to himself, in the empty room. "I destroyed all those lives." On June 29, 2020, Joseph James DeAngelo pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and 13 counts of kidnapping. He also formally admitted to the dozens of rapes he could not be charged with due to California's statute of limitations. In August 2020, over the course of 3 days, the survivors and the families of his 13 murdered victims stood before him in court. They had waited 40 years for the chance to look him in the eye. One by one, they took it. A survivor named Gay Hardwick, who DeAngelo had attacked in her home in 1978 alongside her husband Bob, addressed him directly. She said, "He certainly does deserve to die, in my view. I am seeing that he is trading the death penalty for death in prison. It will be good to put the thing to rest. I think he will never serve the sentence that we have served. We have served the sentence for 42 years." On August 21, 2020, Judge Michael Bowman sentenced Joseph James DeAngelo to multiple life terms in California State Prison, with no possibility of parole. He will die behind bars. He was 74 years old at sentencing. He stood before the court, the same man who for years had stood over bound victims in the dark, and in a raspy, barely audible voice said, "I've listened to all of your statements, each one of them. And I am truly sorry to everyone I've hurt." None of the survivors in the room believed him. The Golden State Killer case leaves 3 lessons that every person watching this needs to understand. Lesson 1, the badge does not mean safety. Joseph DeAngelo was trusted because of his uniform. His victims, his neighbors, his colleagues, all of them extended him a level of trust that a private citizen would never have received. That trust was weaponized. The systems designed to screen people who carry authority, background checks, psychological evaluations, training processes, failed in every single case. If you have a feeling that someone in a position of authority is behaving wrongly, that feeling deserves to be heard. Your instinct is data. Do not dismiss it. Lesson 2, evidence preservation is everything. The DNA sample that identified DeAngelo was collected from crime scenes in the 1970s and 1980s, decades before the technology existed to analyze it in the way that ultimately caught him. Investigators preserved that evidence through budget cuts, through personnel changes, through 40 years of institutional memory loss, because they believed it would one day matter. It mattered. If you have a loved one whose case is cold, ask directly, is the biological evidence from this case still being preserved? That question could change everything. Lesson 3, obsession, in the right hands, is justice. Michelle McNamara was not a detective. She had no official authority. She had no badge, no warrant, no forensic laboratory. She had a desk, a computer, and a refusal to accept that this man would never be held accountable. She died before she could see the result of her work. But her work was part of the chain that ended with a 72-year-old man in handcuffs on his own driveway. The public's attention on a cold case is not interference. It is pressure. And pressure, applied in the right direction, moves mountains. If you have watched this far, you have sat with this story the way the families of these 13 victims have sat with it for 40 years. You did not turn away. Drop a comment and tell us where in the world you are watching. Tell us which part of this story stayed with you. Hit the like button, because every like tells the algorithm that this story matters. That these victims matter. And subscribe, because there are families right now waiting for the same thing these families waited 44 years for. And we are going to keep telling those stories until every one of them is heard.